MTC EBS 202 Mini Test 2. Number 1. Dear Catherine Olson. Catherine Olson. I read this month's issue with great interest. Your feature article on the Grand Palm Beach wedding caught my attention. Grand Palm. What a lovely wedding. The photos were beautiful and the contents of the article were very informative. No wonder you're the most prominent editor of the country's #1 wedding magazine. 1. I'm writing this letter because I am getting married the last week in May in the garden of a beautiful church. 5. The feature article was very helpful in planning my wedding, except that I couldn't find any information on the bridesmaid dress in the photo. I would really appreciate it if you could give me information about the dress through the Dear Reader section in next month's issue. Thanks in advance, and I look forward to reading more of your articles in the future. Sincerely, Janine Robinson. Janine Robinson. MTC. Good job. Let's start. MTC EBS 202 Mini Test 2. Number 2. I drove home, undressed, and got into bed. I was exhausted, but I couldn't sleep. My eyes kept sliding open and it was too great an effort to keep them closed. I got out of bed, went downstairs, and made a cup of chamomile tea from the box Rieni had left behind. Rieni. After the first sip, I poured the distasteful stuff down the drain. I trudged upstairs and climbed back into bed, to lie staring into the dark for another hour, unable to erase the image of Bobby, looking thin and drawn, surrounded by beeping machines, with tubes down her throat, needles inserted into her veins, and electrodes glued to her head and chest. Bobby. I couldn't help but think why she had to go through all this. I didn't know what frightened me more, that she might die, that she might never wake up, or that when she did wake up she wouldn't be Bobby anymore. Bobby. MTC. Good job. Let's start. MTC EBS 202 Mini Test 2. Number 3. There are times when even the best leaders lose their emotional balance. Leadership brings with it responsibility, and responsibility, in times of serious adversity, brings emotional confusion and strain. In this sense, responsibility is like a lever, which can upset a leader's emotional balance when adversity presses down hard on one end. When the adversity is threatening enough or comes without warning, it can unbalance the leader at a single stroke. Even a leader as great as Lincoln was floored more than once in this way. Other times the effect is cumulative, coming after a period of sustained high tension of pressure on one end and resistance on the other until finally the leader's equanimity begins to give way. The point is that every leader has their emotional limits, and there is no shame in exceeding them. MTC. Good job. Let's start. MTC EBS 202 Mini Test 2. Number 4. It's tempting to believe that we can trust the media with our kids, that we don't need to pay close attention to what movies or TV shows our kids are watching, what computer games they're playing, or where they're surfing on the internet. TV. It's much easier to believe that we can trust the media. After all, we're only adding more work and more worry to our lives if we admit that we now need to be as wary of the media as we are of strangers approaching our children on the street. As a result, many parents are in a state of media denial, while others feel overwhelmed and helpless. But the fact is, we need to take as much responsibility for our children's media consumption as we do for their performance in school and their physical well-being. If we're worried about what our kids eat, then we should certainly be worried about what our kids are watching. MTC. Good job. Let's start. MTC EBS 202 Mini Test 2. Number 5. As more companies expand their operations globally, the need to understand the cultures of foreign countries becomes more important. A firm has little chance of selling products in a culture it does not understand. Like people, Products have cultural values and rules that influence their perception and use. Culture, therefore, must be understood before the behavior of individuals within the cultural context can be understood. Colors, for example, may have different meanings in global markets than they do at home. In China, white is the color of mourning and brides wear red. In the United States, black is for mourning and brides wear white. American designers at Universal Studios had to learn about Japanese culture when planning a new theme park for Japan. After extensive surveys and product testing, the result was a Universal Studios theme park with an orderly clockwise layout, Japanese-style American food, and a Jurassic Park water slide designed to prevent riders from getting wet. MTC. Good job. Let's start. MTC. EBS, 202, Mini Test 2. Number 6. Among the powers of government is meting out punishment, and writers such as Montesquieu, Cesar Beccaria, and the American founders thought afresh about the government's license to harm its citizens. Montesquieu, Cesar Beccaria. Criminal punishment, they argued, is not a mandate to implement cosmic justice but part of an incentive structure that discourages antisocial acts without causing more suffering than it prevents. The reason the punishment should fit the crime, for example, is not to balance some mystical scale of justice but to ensure that a wrongdoer stops at a minor crime rather than escalating to a more harmful one. Cruel punishments, whether or not they are in some sense deserved, are no more effective at preventing harm than moderate but surer punishments, and they desensitize spectators and brutalize the society that implements them. MTC. Good job. Let's start. MTC. EBS, 202, Mini Test 2. Number 7. The above table shows the result of a March 2017 survey of adult Internet users in North America who used select professional/sharing economy services. 20173/20173. Respondents in the 18 to 34 age group participated in all of the surveyed aspects of the professional/sharing economy at a greater level than the older respondents. 1834/. 30% of the respondents in the younger group had experience of finding a space to stay from sites like Airbnb, and 1/5 of them used professional services like tax preparation. 30 Airbnb, 51. The younger group were more likely to use car services. 32% of respondents in the younger age group said they used car services, while only 12% of respondents aged 35 and older said they did so. 3512. More than a third of respondents 35 years and up said they shopped on sites that sell pre-owned goods, such as eBay. 3531 eBay. Borrowing or lending cars/bikes was the service that showed the smallest difference between the two age groups. MTC. Good job. Let's start. MTC. EBS, 202, Mini Test 2. Number 8. In 1909, L. Emmett Holt, M.D., published The Care and Feeding of Children, which was the first widely available parental advice book. 1909 L. Emmett Holt, The Care and Feeding of Children. It had been originally published in 1894 as a manual for nursery maids working in a hospital. 1894. He revised the book and put out a new edition specifically for home use. Holt covered the physical care of infants and children, feeding babies, the diet of older children, and miscellaneous advice on diseases, emergencies, playtime, and baby temperament. Holt wrote the book in a question-and-answer format and included much that could be considered common sense. In the book, he emphasized the importance of breast milk and supported this fact by citing decreased mortality rates among breastfed infants. He concluded there is no perfect substitute for good breastfeeding. Holt was a realist, however, and while he devoted 9 pages of his book to breastfeeding, including when, why, and how to wean the baby by 1 year of age, he devoted 60 pages to the ins and outs of artificial feeding. 60. MTC. Good job. Let's start. MTC. EBS, 202, Mini Test 2. Number 11. Pet owners themselves often give signals that can create behaviors that are the opposite of what they want. For example, bite inhibition in animals is a lesson taught by mother, father, and/or siblings in the wild. All puppies have the instinct to bite and the need to chew during the teeth-cutting months, so they must be taught by us, their surrogate parents, what they are allowed and not allowed to put their teeth on. Many humans, however, will play rough with their young animals, encouraging them to be mouthy by grabbing clothing, arms, or hair in play. That only teaches the animal to associate placing their teeth on humans as something fun to do, a behavior that only escalates as they get older. What started out as a cute puppy antic of grabbing your arm becomes unacceptable behavior when that cute little puppy has grown into a 100-pound Rottweiler. 100. MTC. Good job. Let's start. MTC. EBS, 202, Mini Test 2. Number 12. Novice counselors learning active listening techniques often find silence is difficult, just as many of us do in social settings. Remember, however, that in an active listening setting your client may be processing some very difficult emotions and struggling to find the right words. Your client may need space to stop, think, and feel. When you are a novice, a short silence feels very long. It is unlikely to feel as long to the client as it does to you. You may be tempted to jump in, usually with a question, which to the client can feel like an intrusion on their thoughts. You may need to learn to be comfortable with silence. And you may need to learn to trust yourself with this space in the helping relationship. If eventually you need to break the silence, then it is probably better to do this with some kind of reflection than it is to ask a question. MTC. Good job. Let's start. MTC. EBS, 202, Mini Test 2. Number 13. 5 minutes before dinner, Mom goes to Stephanie's room and gently touches her on the shoulder, reminding her it's time to come to dinner. 5 Stephanie. Just before dinner, she gives one last call of, Stephanie, we're starting dinner in 1 minute. Stephanie, 1. A minute later, the family sits down at the table, without Stephanie. 1. Stephanie. A pleasant conversation takes place until 10 minutes later when Stephanie storms in, complaining that she's starving. 10 Stephanie. Mom calmly says, we've already started dinner. There's extra food on the kitchen counter and you can eat there. Stephanie argues that the food is cold. Stephanie. Mom calmly repeats the message that she can eat the extra food on the counter and that they expect her to eat alone in the kitchen. There's no yelling or arguing. Stephanie is getting her dinner. Stephanie. She simply needs to serve herself and eat alone. MTC. Good job. Let's start. MTC. EBS, 202, Mini Test 2. Number 14. Food politics is not a new phenomenon. A battle over the production of bread in Paris was the occasion of Marie Antoinette's unfortunate remark about eating cake, and increases in prices or taxes on food have provoked revolt in countless countries including colonial America. Marie Antoinette. But in Europe in the 21st century, food politics is directed not at scarcity or justice but at identity. 2-1. The slow food movement's prime concern is to protect the diverse, local traditions responsible for artisanal food production and encourage people to eat local ingredients. The threatened loss of specific tastes and the local cultures that produce them animate this movement. They deploy the aesthetic and symbolic content of food in a search for a more authentic lifestyle anchored in local traditions, which then becomes the idiom through which political mobilization occurs. Thus, the slow food movement understands the food artisan, not as a conservative standing in the way of progress but as someone charged with the preservation of local heritage. MTC. Good job. Let's start. MTC. EBS, 202, Mini Test 2. Number 15. There is a story about William Penn, founder of the state of Pennsylvania. Pennsylvania William Penn. Part of his apparel as an aristocrat was to wear a sword. He asked George Fox, one of the early members of the Religious Society of Friends, Quakers, whether it was all right to wear one. Religious Society of Friends, Quakers, George Fox. Fox's response was not take it off this instant, we are a pacifist organization but wear it as long as you can. Fox. I find that a good rule to live by, eat meat for as long as you can, fly to overseas holidays for as long as you can, drink alcohol for as long as you can, give up when and if the discomfort grows too much. Pay attention to the inner truth. We speak of having choices and, of course, compared to those who struggle to survive, we do. But to talk of making decisions is to speak from an external perspective. There is an interior imperative, and the way becomes clear. MTC. Good job. Let's start. MTC. EBS, 202, Mini Test 2. Number 16. The figures regarding the comparative cost of bottled water show just how unacceptable it is for public money to be spent on bottled water. At 36 cents a liter, tap water is 141 times cheaper than the best-selling mineral water in Europe. 36141. Arguably the costs of producing bottled water can be borne by Western industrialized countries, but from the perspective of middle-income countries, such as Mexico, such prices are disproportionately high, and it is worrying that the proliferation of bottled water could induce municipal authorities in developing nations to de-emphasize public drinking water provision. A related issue involves the rapid proliferation of dual water pipe systems, especially in China and East Asia. On the basis of the assumption that standard municipal hook UPS are unfit for human consumption, developers have been quick to add value, and profit, to their developments by installing separate pure water supply lines, at great cost to the consumer. What is more, the greater the proliferation of such systems, the more municipal supply of drinking water, which depends on extensive cross-subsidies, from urban to rural, from rich to poor, etc., is undermined. MTC. Good job. Let's start. MTC. EBS, 202, Mini Test 2. Number 17. Much drinking that people and other animals do does not reduce a water deficit. For example, the amount that rats drink depends greatly on the time of day, independent of when the water is actually needed. Rats receiving 50% of their food during the day drink only about 25% of their water during that time. They drink most of their water at night even though they aren't getting most of their food then. 5025. Let's consider an example that you may be able to relate to more directly. If you keep a record, you'll see that you do most of your drinking while you're eating a meal. One possible reason might be that you need the water to help digest your food, to maintain the optimal food-to-water ratio in your GI tract. Another possible reason might be that you need the water because the food is salty and you need to replenish the water that the salt draws out of your cells. Both reasons are, however, only partly correct. You don't actually need the water until several hours after you eat. When you drink during a meal, you're anticipating a need for water and taking advantage of available water to prevent a deficit. Animals drink, as well as eat, before there's any actual need for doing so, following the maxim, dig a well before you are thirsty. MTC. Good job. Let's start. MTC. EBS, 202, Mini Test 2. Number 18. Ancient cultures traditionally told stories under the stars and around the flickering flames of the campfire. Some cultures still do so to this day, even in the United States of the 21st century. 2.1. Many continue such traditions in backyards, on family trips, and at camp. There is no denying, however, that in the past half-century or so the flickering light around which we gather as clans trends more and more toward the electronic screen, and in recent years these have become increasingly individual and handheld rather than communal. Nevertheless, the storytelling potential of constantly evolving social media has much to recommend it as a vehicle for the transmission of cultural information, and any outright rejection of technology and other new avenues of communication for the transmission of American folklore is premature and, in the end, unwise. MTC. Good job. Let's start. MTC. EBS, 202, Mini Test 2. Number 19. The sense of touch is one of the factors which prevent people from being convinced of the truth that the senses of sight, hearing, and taste occur within the brain. For example, if you told someone that he sees a book within his brain, he would, if he didn't think carefully, reply, "I can't be seeing the book in my brain, look, I'm touching it with my hand." Or, if we said we cannot know whether the original of this book exists as a material object outside or not, again the same superficially minded person might answer, "No, look, I'm holding it with my hand and I feel the hardness of it. That isn't a perception but an existence which has material reality." However, there is a fact that such people cannot understand, or perhaps just ignore. The sense of touch also occurs in the brain as much as do all the other senses. That is to say, when you touch a material object, you sense whether it is hard, soft, wet, sticky or silky in the brain. The effects that come from your fingertips are transmitted to the brain as an electrical signal, and these signals are perceived in the brain as the sense of touch. For instance, if you touch a rough surface, you can never know whether the surface is, in reality, indeed a rough surface, or how a rough surface actually feels. That is because you can never touch the original of a rough surface. The knowledge that you have about touching a surface is your brain's interpretation of certain stimuli. MTC. Good job. Let's start. MTC. EBS, 202, Mini Test 2. Number 20. When the amygdala is triggered, it hijacks or commandeers our entire biological system to respond to threats. When we detect danger, the response time of the amygdala is around 33 milliseconds, and for some people, half that time. 3. The prefrontal cortex, our thinking brain, requires at least 10 times that amount of time to process information from the environment as a conscious thought. 10. For millions of years in human evolutionary history, the fight or flight reaction pattern triggered by the amygdala has survived because it saves lives. In the tooth and claw days, this adrenaline-charged system allowed our ancestors to club the predator, or grab the baby and run. In modern life, the stress response still saves lives when we hit the brakes to avoid an oncoming car. However, since our hair-triggered reactions to extreme stressors do not include a cognitive review, we also react to a lot of false alarms. Think of road rage as the adult equivalent of a 2-year-old's, or 12-year-old's, temper tantrum. 2.12. Every day, in families all over the world, people yell, scream, curse, and take flight from loved ones when their buttons, amygdalae, are pushed. MTC. Good job. Let's start. MTC. EBS, 202, Mini Test 2. Number 21. For years people thought that ice melting under pressure was the only reason for ice being slippery. But it turns out that the story is more complex than that, because it doesn't explain why ice is still slippery at temperatures well below its freezing point, or when the pressure isn't enough to melt it, e.g. ice is still slippery if you wear flat shoes, not just ice skates. It turns out that friction plays a big part as the ice skates, skis, or glaciers slide. The friction generates heat, which melts the surface of the ice slightly. But that's still not the whole story, as it doesn't explain why ice is slippery even if you stand still. Modern analysis has shown that because the molecules at the surface of ice are inherently unstable due to the lack of molecules above them, the surface reconstructs to form a liquid-like layer. This verified the original hypothesis made by the famous physicist Michael Faraday in 1850 that all ice has an intrinsic thin layer of water at the surface. 1850 Michael Faraday. So ice is slippery due to its inherent surface water layer, which can be enhanced using pressure and friction. MTC. Good job. Let's start. MTC. EBS, 202, Mini Test 2. Number 22. Extinction involves the removal of a positive reward. Extinction occurs when one tries to eliminate an undesirable behavior by withholding rewards when the behavior occurs. A student who is late for class misses the teacher's reward for promptness that day. By withholding the reward, the teacher can eventually eliminate the chronic tardiness. The tardiness becomes extinct. However, extinction can also work on good, desirable behaviors that are not rewarded. A student who works hard during class, but whose hard work goes unnoticed, may soon stop working as diligently. Can you imagine receiving the chapter, state, or American FFA, Future Farmers of America, degree with no awards, no banquet, and no state convention or national convention to attend? FFA? Without these awards or some other type of recognition, students would no longer do the work that goes into earning these awards. That behavior would become extinct. MTC. Good job. Let's start. MTC. EBS, 202, Mini Test 2. Number 23. People tend to overestimate how harshly others will judge them. This dynamic may apply to the case of help seeking. Even a small request can make the help seeker feel self-conscious, embarrassed, and guilty. In our research, we have found that the anxiety help seekers experience over how their request will come across is surprising to potential helpers who do not know what all the fuss is about. In one study, we asked 2 samples of potential helpers, teaching assistants and peer advisors, to estimate the number of students who would seek their help during a single semester. The peer advisors overestimated by over 60%, and the teaching assistants by 20%, the number of students who would ask them for help. 60-20. This prediction error emerged even though the peer advisors had been students themselves the prior year, and the majority of teaching assistants had worked as teaching assistants before, often for the same class. Nevertheless, their past experience as help seekers offered no clues in predicting others' future help-seeking behavior. MTC. Good job. Let's start. MTC. EBS, 202, Mini Test 2. Number 24-25. As railroads developed during the 19th century in the United States, they offered the world's first means of transportation that was largely resistant to the effects of bad weather and able to function throughout the year. 19. The development of the nation's rail network from 1840 through the 1890s brought reliable movement of people and goods throughout the nation, with many fewer seasonal impacts than happened to other existing forms of transportation, all of which suffered greatly with the weather's capriciousness. 1840-1890. Railroads now enabled farmers to get their harvested crops to market in a matter of days, whether they were shipped in July or January. 71. Prior to the coming of the railroads, shipments of anything could not be accomplished during many months of the year, and other forms of moving goods were extremely slow and apt to be halted for days and weeks by conditions such as low water, muddy roads, and storms. By contrast, except in extreme weather conditions, trains could be counted on to reach their destinations on time. Even today, fog, heavy rain, or snow and ice stop commercial aircraft operations and slow vehicular traffic, often causing multiple accidents. But trains continue to operate in such conditions. Over the past 150 years, with ever newer technologies, the railroads have constantly worked to minimize their weather problems. 150. They have buried cables and employed radios for communication to escape the major losses that snowstorms and freezing rain once caused to their exposed wire-based communication systems. They built snow sheds in mountainous areas where heavy snow caused trouble. They installed gas-fired heaters to keep their switches from freezing. Taller and stronger bridges have reduced many flood-related problems. MTC. Good job. Let's start. MTC. EBS, 202, Mini Test 2. Number 2628. Just off the coast of New Hampshire, USA, the submarine Squalus sailed along the surface of the Atlantic Ocean. Squalus. It was 8:40 a.m., on May 23, 1939. 1939523840. Brand new, Squalus was undergoing sea trials before she was delivered to the U.S. Navy. Squalus. As she cut through the sea, her captain, 35-year-old Lieutenant Oliver Naquin, stood face to the wind on the conning tower. 35 Oliver Naquin. The previous 19 test dives he had carried out with his ship had all gone to plan, but the next procedure would test both the 56 men in his crew, and their vessel, to the limit. 5-6. Squalus was about to carry out a practice crash dive, an emergency procedure where a submarine under attack on the surface submerges as quickly as possible. Squalus. Naquin called down to his radio operator, ordering him to report their position to the submarine's home port of Portsmouth, New Hampshire. Knockin', Portsmouth. Then he hit a button on the bridge which sounded the crash dive alarm. He hurried below to the control room, closing the upper and lower tower hatches. Inside the control room, men stood alert by dials and instruments, fully involved in the complex sequence of events that would take the submarine smoothly under the water. Naquin called out a series of well-rehearsed commands. Knock in. Secure all vents. Flood main ballast tanks 1 and 2. Everything was going like clockwork. 1-2. As all outside vents and hatches were closed, a set of indicator lights changed from red to green to show that the ship was sealed against the sea. The ship's ballast tanks rapidly filled with water, and Squalus swiftly sank to 15 m. Squalus 1-5. Squalus settled underwater and Naquin and his men congratulated themselves on a successful operation. Squalus knockin'. But then a strange sound made him startle. An instant later, a terrified sailor looked up from an intercom and shouted, "The engine room is flooding." Naquin gave his order to surface immediately. Knock in. Compressed air was injected into the flooded ballast tanks and the submarine began to rise. The front part of the ship broke the surface, but tons of water were now pouring into the rear of the ship. The weight of water dragged sharply down the rear of the ship. MTC. Good job.